What's up guys, Vylocity from Pitchfork Academy, back with another Unreal Engine 5 tutorial, and in this video I'm going to be showing you an in-depth guide on how to achieve the retro PS1 style graphics that are quite popular lately, and I believe that's because people love that feeling of nostalgia, so I'm going to show you how to create that in your own projects. I'll be showing you how to pixelate your graphics at the engine level to just generally give higher performance and make your game look more pixelated. I'll also be showing you how to create a dithering post-process material, which simulates the limited color spectrum from the PS1 and give you some dithering to cover up in between the bands as they did in the PS1. Also, I'll be showing you how to pixelate your textures directly in the engine at any resolution that you like to get that vintage look, and also adjust the camera's aspect ratio to mimic that of a PS1, which is that 4:3 aspect ratio. And to finish up, just some general lighting tips to further enhance that feeling of the PS1. Just before we get started, I wanted to let you know that my Patreon is now live, and for a limited time, it's 50% off. You can join Velocity's Vault for just $5 a month, and as long as you subscribe before the end of October, you'll be locked in at that legacy price permanently. Velocity's Vault includes project files for my materials and graphics tutorials, with new ones added every week. There's also an ultimate tier if you'd like a little bit more guidance, and you can schedule a one-on-one call with me to go over your art style, material setup, or anything graphics related. Alright, let's get into the tutorial. Alrighty guys, here we are in a default version of Unreal Engine 5.6. However, this will work in any version of Unreal Engine 5. I'm also using the third-person template just as a starting point, but of course you can use any project that you already have. Since I'll be going a bit more in depth than other tutorials on this topic, and we're trying to achieve an older version of rendering from the PS1 era of games, we will definitely need to be changing quite a few things in the project settings and the DefaultEngine.ini file. So what I recommend that you do is just to duplicate your project before continuing. That way you have sort of another branch to work off of. And if you need to reference back to how your project looked before, then you'll be able to do that. I also want to point out that since we are using a modern game engine, we do have a lot of newer features available to us, and that allows you to be a little bit more creative than simply trying to just copy an older art style from the PS1 era. For example, where one person might decide that they don't want shadows, you might decide that you want to use virtual shadow maps, or one person might say, okay, I don't want to have reflections, but you might think, oh, it kind of would be cool if we had PS1 style rendering with dithering and pixelated textures and vertex snapping, but with full ray trace reflections, then you're able to do that as well. You could even enable Lumen, but there's going to be a lot of times where I might change one setting where I'd like you guys to think about, well, maybe I want to keep that setting enabled or disabled. So the first thing that I want to do is just really quickly get a new character to use to visualize the effects with. So I'll go to Fab really quickly by clicking on Window and then go down to Fab. And then at the top, I want to search for PSX Skeleton. Enter. And then I'll filter by price free. And then I want to use the Skeleton Necromancer. You can, of course, experiment around with different ones, but I found that this one has some nice textures that we'll use, and it comes with a nice little staff. So I'll just click Add to Project. It will do its thing and add it to the project for us, and then it brings us right to it. I'll just go over here and go to the mesh, and then I'll drag the skeletal meshes out for both the character and the staff. Just line those up a little bit better. The next thing that I want to do is go into the project settings. So I'll just go to Edit and Project Settings. And then I will just hold this over to the right a little bit. All right, once we're in the project settings, we can go ahead and scroll down until we find Rendering. And then in here, we can scroll until we find the Global Illumination method. Now, this is one of the settings that I definitely recommend maybe experimenting with if you're going for more of a hybrid realistic PS1 style where maybe you want to have some pixelated graphics, some dithering, some vertex snapping, but you want to keep lumen, global illumination, and reflections. I think that would actually be quite cool, but for the purpose of the tutorial, I'm just going to turn it off so we get more of that flat look. And then I'll set reflection method from lumen to screen space. I'll keep a little bit of reflections, but I won't do the lumen. Then I'll scroll down until I find support hardware ray tracing. I just want to turn that off just to get some more performance in case my computer is using it which since I do have a NVIDIA card that it definitely is using that, so I'll just turn that off. And I'll also go ahead and turn off Nanite. Really no reason to use Nanite in a PS1 style game, of course, unless you're going for more of that hybrid realistic style like I mentioned earlier. You could leave this on if you're using Nanite meshes. So I'll turn that off, and then I'll go down until I find the next section that I want to mess with is the auto exposure. So I found that auto exposure, if you turn auto exposure off, it doesn't look like it really changes. So what I like to do is just leave this on and then change auto exposure here to manual. And then you can set the number until it looks bright enough. I found a value of 11 looks decent, but you could fine tune this. You can do 11.5. Actually, that doesn't look quite too bad. 12 looks a little bit too bright. I'll go ahead and leave 11.5. Next, I want to go until I find the motion blur. This is something that you can experiment with turning on or off. I'll go ahead and turn it off. Anti-aliasing method, we'll be setting this to be none here. And MSAA.Count will set to be no MSAA. Now, in the editor and playing in the viewport and Pi, this should all work. We should have no anti-aliasing, but I found sometimes in a standalone game or a packaged game, this might not carry over. So we'll just need to double check that in the DefaultEngine.ini file, that this is also set to none or 0. So we'll check that after we restart the project. Next, we can scroll down some more and we'll find default screen percentage size. So one thing to know about Unreal Engine 5 is that since it expects that you're going to use the new TSR anti-aliasing upscaling method, it tries to set your screen percentage to be a lower value by default and then upscale it from there. So you can do custom override here. But what we actually want to do is go to manual screen percentage, and I want to set mine to be 75. Now this directly will relate to how pixelated your screen looks and how much more performance you gain. So you could go as low as 25 if you want super pixelated, super vintage PS1 graphics, or 50. But for this tutorial, I'll be going to 75, which I think looks quite nice. And then screen percentage mode, we want to change to manual. And then we'll actually need to change this value in a couple more places, but once you figure out what value that you like, you'll want to keep that in mind and change it in the different spots. I believe that that's all for the rendering section. And we just need now to search for screen percentage. And here's the settings that we just changed, and we need to also do it for the editor. So I'll change anywhere that it says based on display resolution to manual. And then I want it to be that same number that I have set up top here. So I like 75, but again, if you decide that you want it to be more pixelated, you'll want to lower that in every place. The last thing that I want to change is I want to search for default RHI. And this essentially will make for one, it'll improve your frame rate, but it changes a few of the ways that things are rendered in your project. This is one of the reasons I suggested duplicating your project, because some shaders might require DirectX 12, but I think that for most shaders, and especially in a PS1 style game, you could get away with DirectX 11, and the performance boost should be pretty noticeable. But again, this is something that you can experiment with. If you are using Lumen and nanites and all of that stuff, it might be worth keeping on DirectX 12. I'll go ahead and switch to DirectX 11. And now we should be good to go ahead and restart. And it might take a sec to recompile all of your shaders and everything, so I'll meet you guys back here in a minute. All right, now that we're back in the editor, I'll just go ahead and close out of the project settings. And the first thing that I want to check is that screen percentage. There's a bug, it seems like, that even if we set that value to be manual and overridden, it will still set this to be some random value. So for example, it's 77 instead of my 75. So this is just something that you'll want to check when you're messing around with your project and trying to fine tune your number for the pixelation. You'll just hit the custom override and set it to that number that you want to see. So if you did a lower number, you'd set that there, but I'll do 75. And yeah, so this is looking pretty good already. We have some nice stair stepping because there's no anti-aliasing on any of the edges. And we also have no global illumination. So the corners of all of the meshes where they intersect are looking pretty flat, which is good and very reminiscent of that old art style. The next thing that we need to do is just to double check in our project's DefaultEngine.ini file some of these settings. So to do that, I'll just go ahead and right click on my content folder here and show in Explorer. You could also just go and find your project in your file browser. So I have mine in this UEF5 folder, and here's my content folder, but we need to go up one level. So I'll go back to my project name and then go to my config. And then here we have the default engine file. So I'll just double click to open that up. So once we're in the DefaultEngine.ini file, it'll look quite intimidating because there's a lot of settings in here. These are all the settings that override how the game is packaged and some settings that affect it in an actual packaged build. And we just want to find where we have the screen percentage and all of this kind of stuff here. And then I'll just click enter a couple times until we have our own new space. And then we want to copy in a couple of things, and they'll be down below in the description. I'll copy in these two here, and this helps make sure that things don't look too blurry. We also need to go up and change MSAA.Count to be 0. And that's all looking pretty good. Now we can just go ahead and click File and Save. Now, as a good measure, I'm just going to restart the engine one more time so those settings take effect. So I want to change my viewport scalability back to low so we don't have the shadows and it looks really, really flat. And we still get the nice shading from where the shadows would be on our meshes, which is good. This is kind of how it looked back in the PS1 era because they would use vertex lighting to paint on meshes where the shadow would be. And this kind of gives that look because the meshes have the shadows, but they don't cast shadows. So that's kind of a nice effect. So yeah, now we can look at how to start pixelating the textures of our characters and any mesh in our game that we want to have the pixelated texture look. So now I'll just make a folder for materials in my content browser, and I'll just name it materials. And then inside of this, I'll right click and make another folder, and I'll call this PS1. We'll keep all of our materials in here that will get the pixelation effect. So I'll double click here and then we'll right click and make a material. I'll call this M_PS1. Open this up. And the first thing that we can do is, before we make any changes in here, I'll go back to my content browser and go to my skeleton. Or really, you want to go to wherever the textures are for your characters. So I'm going to the skeleton, necromancer, textures, and I'll just drag in one of the base color textures and one of the normal maps. And then from here, I'll drag RGB into base color and the normal into normal. Right click on both of them and convert to parameters. I'll call this top one color and this one here normal. This really isn't going too in depth to creating the material. I definitely recommend, making it more of a complex material for your characters. You could have all sorts of parameters for roughness, and you could have textures for roughness and emissive and all of that. But for this tutorial, it'll just be basic for color and normal. Now I can go ahead and save this, and I'll close out of it and go back to find that in my materials folder. And then I'll right click and make a material instance. I'll call it mi_PS1_skeleton. And then I will click on my skeleton guy and then find the material slot. So I'll drag this in. Looking pretty good. And then what we need to do now is go to our material and find those textures. I'll just check these to be on. And then I want to browse to the textures. And here's where the magic happens. So this is an action that you can do sort of in bulk. So if you have a bunch of textures in a folder, that's ideal because you'll want to do this to all of the textures at once. So I'll click on the first texture in my folder and then shift and click on the last one. You could also just click Control A. Then I'll right click and go to Asset Actions and then Edit Selection and Property Matrix. This allows you to edit all of the textures at once. And what we want to do is change the filtering of the texture. So we want to find the texture group and then go to Advanced and then find Filter. And then I want to switch it from default really quickly. Let me just, so we can see the effect change in real time. I'll click on default and then I'll click nearest. Switch back. So it might not look like much of a change yet, but that's because these textures are actually, look, they're 4096 for the base color and the normal, and then the staff is 2048. So these are quite high resolution, but once we go back to our edit property matrix and we search in the details panel for max, we'll find maximum texture size. So this will edit the texture size for all of the textures at once. I'm not too worried about making the base color higher than the staff because we're lowering the resolution of all of them at the same amount, and we're already getting such high frames. I'm not too worried about maybe having the textures staggered in sizes. So I'll just set everything to be 512 and we'll see how that looks. So boom, right away, fully pixelated textures. That looks pretty awesome in my opinion. You could even go lower with this, and you want to make sure it's a power of 2. So once you have that number, you can actually just do a slash and 2, and you'll get the 512 divided by 2, which is 256. And now we get this really pixelated skeleton guy, and the staff is also pixelated. The staff isn't using the new material yet, so let's go ahead and create that now. So I'll browse to my skeleton material, and I will duplicate it. And then after skeleton, I'll put underscore staff. Then I can go ahead and open this up, open up my textures category, and then browse to the textures. And then we want to just replace everything with the staff textures. And now we can put this new material on that. So if we browse to this, okay, now we got the staff material. I'll just replace it there. So that's looking pretty awesome. Super pixelated, super vintage looking, and it's all done right inside the engine. Next, we can look at how to create the vertex snapping effect. And if you're not familiar with that, basically it's an effect where as you look around a mesh or the mesh rotates based on the camera angle, the vertices look like they sort of snap around. And that's because they're snapping to the nearest pixel, because back in the day in PS1 graphics, they couldn't have in-between values. So it just snaps to the nearest integer of the pixel on the screen, and that's where it gets this sort of effect. You can definitely look more into that. I'm not necessarily an expert on vertex snapping, but I have found a way that lets you basically mimic an effect as close as possible to this by snapping the vertices around on the screen with the world position output on the material node. So we'll be able to make a material function and drag and drop it into our materials that we have, and it will just simply work, and that's pretty cool. So what I'll do is go back to my materials folder, and then I'll right click and go to material, the drop down here, and I want to make a material parameter collection. I'll name this MPC for material parameter collection underscore global. So think of these as global parameters that you can basically control multiple master materials with, and it's sort of like a home base for parameters that you need to control in multiple different places. So I'll go ahead and open this up, and then I'll make a new scalar value. Open this index. I'll name it vertex snap mount. And I'll set the default value to be 0.3. This is something that you can adjust to taste. And then I'll just save this. I can close out of most of this stuff here, or all of it. And then now we can right click and make a material function. So I'll go to the drop down here and go to advanced and then material function. I'll call this MF underscore vertex snapping. Whoops. Once we have this, we can open it up. And the first thing that we should do is drag in our material parameter collection. And once we have this, we can set the collection. Oh, it's already set to the global. That's because we dragged it in. You can also right click and search for these as well. It's called a collection parameter. But this one's already set to global, and then the parameter name will be our vertex snap amount. And then from here, we want to right click and search for world position. But we want to change the method here to camera relative world position. And then from here, we want to drag off and divide. And we'll divide it by our vertex snap amount. From here, we want to floor the value. On any of these nodes, you can hold Control and Alt and see a little bit what it does, but basically this rounds down the value, similar to what I was talking about in the PS1 graphics. It sort of rounds the value to the nearest pixel because it can't have an in-between value. So this sort of mimics that effect. Next, we can drag off of this and search for multiply. And then we'll plug in our vertex snap amount again to this. We're dividing, flooring, and then multiplying. And the reason we do the multiply at the end is to normalize the value. And then from here, we want to subtract from our world position again. So I'll just drag this all the way down, and then I'll double click on this node here, and then I'll double click again to get another reroute just to clean it up a bit. And then we'll plug this directly into the output. Now we can go ahead and save this, and we're done here. And now we have a material function that we can drag into any master material that we want to apply the vertex snapping to. For example, you might have multiple different master materials, one for cars, one for characters, and you need to apply the effect in both of them. And you don't want to have just one big master uber material. So what we can do is just drag it into any material that we have. So I just have this one material, so I'm just going to drag it into this one. So I'll go back to my materials folder and drag in my MF vertex snapping into here. And we just want to plug it directly into the world position offset. Now if we save, we should be able to visualize this change. So yeah, now as you can see, if I approach the meshes, you can see they sort of wobble and give you that vintage PS1 feel where the vertices are snapping around. And if we go up here to lit and click on wireframe, you can actually see the vertices themselves, and you can visualize what's happening a little bit more. And I'll actually go ahead and turn down my camera speed. So if you go really slow, it's easier to tell. So yeah, they're snapping around quite a bit. Now, if this looks too noisy and too jarring for you, I actually recommend to reduce the polygons of your characters even more. So if you're using, for example, metahumans and you're trying to get this PS1 style graphics, then you'll definitely want to go into your skeletal mesh or your static mesh, whatever meshes that you have, and then find the reduction settings. And if it's a skeletal mesh, it'll be a percentage of 1. And if it's a static mesh, it'll be out of 100. So for this guy, I'll do 0.25. So currently we have 12,000 triangles, 7,000 vertices. So we're going to get a quarter of that now. We have to click apply changes though at the bottom. And as you can see, the mesh changed and now we have, oh, whoops. Now we have only 3,000 triangles, 2,000 vertices. And if we save and go back, the vertex snapping will happen over a greater distance. So it won't look as sort of noisy, if that makes any sense. Again, if we go back to wireframe, you can see that there's just less triangles now for it to go between. And if I go back to lit mode, click on the staff, we can do the same thing for the staff. So in the staff, we want to find reduction settings again. And like I said, this is out of 100. So I'll set this to be 25. Save. And definitely tell that it changed a bit. If it ever looks too different or things start to break or there's artifacts, you'll just want to raise this number until it looks good enough for you. I'll just go ahead and save that. Yeah, now we have this really nice vertex snapping effect, pixelation on the textures, really sharp edges. And now we can go ahead and look at adding the dithering. So we'll be creating a post-process material to basically separate the color of our scene into different bands and then add a dithering effect in between each band to sort of soften it. Because in the PS1 graphics, that's kind of what they did. They had only a limited amount of color that they could work with, so it was cut into bands, and to make it look less banded, they added some dithering texture in between the bands. So that's what we'll be doing now. Here's an example of dithering on the left, which is what the PS1 did to sort of break up and make the splotchiness of this version on the right disappear. The version here on the right is a mod that somebody did to remove the dithering, but as you can see, the version on the left is the sort of truer version of the PS1 rendering that makes the splotchiness kind of go away. And here's another example from a video titled "Why Did the PlayStation 1 Have So Much Dithering?" from Modern Vintage Gamer. And what's interesting about this is this actually looks to me like a little bit too much dithering, hence the name of the video. So we'll be adding some controls in our post-process material to dial it back and make sure we can blend in our original color with it as well if we want. But we'll still be able to get this nice dithering texture. Once we're back in our level, we can go ahead and go into our PS1 folder. So I'm just in my materials folder and then inside of PS1, and I'll right click and create another material. I'll call this m_p for post process _ dither. Once we have that, I'll double click to open it up. And the first thing that we need to change is a couple settings on the left in the details panel. The first being the material domain. Since it's not a surface, we need to change it to a post process. And then you'll see we just get the emissive color, so that's good. Next, we can scroll down until we find the blendable location and just make sure that it's scene color after tone mapping. This basically is the order in which this appears within the graphical rendering process of all of the different buffers. So you have the depth of field buffer, the screen space reflection, the translucency, the tone mapper, bloom, all that. So we just need to make sure that it is after the tone mapping. From here, we can go ahead and start getting out a few nodes here. So I'll just right click and search for a scene texture. And then when we select this, we just need to change the scene texture ID from scene color to post process input 0. This gives us the scene basically that we already see. So this is our post processing effect that we already have. It's just blank. And then off of the color, we can multiply by a certain number, and this will be the bands of color. So I'll just hold S and click for a scalar, and I'll call this bands. I'll set the default value to 12, but this is something that you'll be able to play around with on your own. Basically, this is how many bands of color that are allowed in the final scene. So the lower this is, the less colors that you'll see, and it'll be more banded. If you raise this really high, you'll see no banding at all. I think 12 is a good middle ground. And then off of this, we can do a reroute declaration node, add named reroute declaration, and I'll call this scaled color. Because we'll reuse this later, but we still need to do stuff off of this. So this will allow us to, for example, get scaled color, so we don't have wires going everywhere later. So just to help keep things organized. From here, we can do a floor. And then we'll also reroute this, named reroute, and we'll call this floor color. From here, we can drag off and search for a divide. And we want to divide this by the number of bands. This will normalize it. And then from here, we can do another reroute node. And we'll call this lower band. Essentially, we need to get the lower and upper band of each band, and then we're going to apply dithering between those two. So just stick with me. It gets a little bit confusing, but just follow along and it should all work out just fine. So from the floor color here, we can drag off and search for add. And we just want to add one, so we can leave this by default. And then we'll get another divide. So basically what this is doing, I'll put this into the B there, and then add will go into A. Our lower band is here, and then we're adding one to the band, so it gives us the one above it, if that makes any sense. From here, we can drag off and search for reroute declaration node, and we'll call this upper band. Then we can highlight all of this, click C on our keyboard, and we'll call this color bands. Next, we can go ahead and create the dither texture, and we're going to be doing that in screen space. So basically, depending on the screen that you're using, it's going to scale it. So you might have to change your scale of this, but essentially this will be in screen space, which will give you that dither effect. So we'll right click and search for screen aligned UVs. And we'll drag off of X, Y 100%, and we will get a multiply. And then we can right click and search for view size. This node, if you hold Control and Alt on it, you can see what it says. It actually outputs the dimensions of your current screen. So depending on your resolution that you have set, earlier we did screen percentage to 75, or you might have done 50 or 25. You might have to, like I said, change your dithering size just to dial it in to look good. Off of this, I'm going to get a divide. And then I'll hold S and click for a scalar, and we'll call this dither size. And I'll set mine to 16. We'll plug that in. And then this goes into the multiply. And now we can get our texture sample. And we'll call this dither texture. We can leave this as it is for now. We'll import the texture once we create the material. And then from R, we want to subtract. And here's where we'll add some controls for adjusting the amount of the dithering. Well, there's a couple ways you can control the amount, but this will control the actual texture. So we'll get a scalar parameter. We'll call this dither bias. Default of 0 is fine. And then we'll get a multiply. And then I will copy and paste dither bias, and I'll call it dither contrast. Default value on this one should be 1. Anything multiplied by 1 is itself, and subtracting 0 will do nothing. So this by default is not making any change. They're just some parameters that you can control to fine-tune it to your own art style. From here, we can drag off and search for reroute declaration node. And I'll call this dither texture. Now we can go ahead and select all of this, click C, and we'll call this dither texture. Now is where it's going to get a little bit sort of spaghetti, but as long as you pay attention and stick with me, you'll be able to follow along just fine. So we need to right click and search for our scaled color that we set earlier. Remember, we set that up here. So this is basically just this information here. And we're going to drag off and search for a subtract. And then we can right click and search for floor color. And then we need to drag off and search for a component mask. Now it's very important. You need to select this and uncheck G. So you only have R. It'll say mask R. And then we need to duplicate this 2 more times. And then on the second one, it should just only be the G. And on the third one, only be the B. So you have R, G, B. Basically, we're going to apply this texture and do the calculation on all of the channels of the color. So we're going to do it on the R channel, the G channel, and the B channel. And you have to do it separately for this to work correctly. So we'll plug all these in here. And then I will actually copy and paste these 2 more times. And then we need to right click and search for our lower band. And then this goes into the R, G, and B. And then we're going to do it for our upper band as well. Now we need an if node. You can right click and search for if. And I'll just copy and paste this a couple of times. And then we can search for our dither texture that we set up here. And this will be the B on each of these. So we're going to check if A is greater than, or the brightness is greater than our dither texture. And if it is, we'll do something. And if it isn't, we'll do something else. And that's just going to be these other values. So we can start by plugging in the top ones here. The R goes into A of this one. the G goes into A of the second one, and the B goes into the A of the third one. The G, sorry, not the G, but the R of this lower band will go into the final pin, so the A is less than B of the top one. The G of this second section will go into the final pin on this one. And the B of this second one will go into the final pin on the third one. So you can see we're kind of swizzling this information. And it, like I said, it gets quite confusing, but as long as you go slow, you should be able to connect this all up just fine. And then the final one, so the R will go into both the A and this A equals B. So I'll just double click on this one to create another reroute node. We'll plug it in like that. And the same for this one. So we'll plug it in there, double click on this wire, plug it into A equals B. Then we can go off of the B here, plug it into this one, double click, plug it into A equals B as well. Now that we have that, we can right click and search for make float 3. I'll plug each one of these into the respective outputs. If you don't see this node, there should be something similar. Yeah, in 5.6 or 5.5, they took away some other version of this node and replaced it with this. But there should be a blue version. If not, you can also get an append vector, and you would put your RG and then put this into there, and then you would put your B here. So this is the same as this, but since we have this one in 5.6, I'm going to use this one. Now we can finally lerp this back in with our original color from the scene. So I'll scroll out and I'll just grab this node here and copy it and then paste it down here. And then I want to drag off of color and search for component mask. And since this node from the color, it actually gives you a 4-channel vector. It gives you RGBA, A for alpha. We don't need the alpha, so when you click on this mask, make sure only RG and B are selected. So it should say RGB on this, and then A is unchecked. Then we can get a lerp. So I'll hold L on my keyboard and click for a lerp. And then I'll plug this one into A, and then our other information into B. And this allows us to interpolate or blend between this information and then everything else that we just did, being our original scene and then the dithered scene. So we can basically tone down the dithering effect with this value here. So we're going to get a scalar parameter by holding S and click. And I'll call this dither alpha. And then default value will be 1. That means we're going to fully use the effect. And then if we want it to be toned down a bit, you would just lower this on the instance. All right, so then I'll drag my root node here down to line up. And we'll plug this into there. Cool, and as you can see, it's sort of giving us that effect, but we don't have the right texture yet. So we'll need to do that now. So there will be a link in the description for a Google Drive link where you can download the dithering texture. So you'll just want to download that, and then you can import it into just this root folder here. So I'll do that now. I'll drag in my texture here. It'll import it, and there we go. I'll just go ahead and save all really quickly. So if it crashes, we don't lose that. And then we can go back to our material. So I'll go into PS1 again. And now I'll right click on the dither material and create a material instance. And I'll just remove the underscore inst at the end and set it to be MI in the front for material instance. Now we can go into our material instance and we can turn on our texture here, and we want to replace it with our new texture. Now you can see the effect a little bit better. And we can go ahead and save that now and check on all of our other parameters. Before we change it, let's go ahead and just put it on in our scene. All right, now we can go ahead and go to our post-process volume. If you don't already have one of these, you can go ahead and go up to the cube with the little plus and go down to volumes, and then you'll find post-process volume. Just drag it into your scene anywhere, and then in the search panel, search for infinite and make sure that infinite extent unbound is true. That way it covers your whole scene no matter what. Or you could place specific volumes, and for example, if you wanted to enter a level, then the effect turns on, you could do that. But I'll just keep it everywhere. I think that it makes the most sense. And then we can search for material and just open the drop down here for post-process materials, add an array element, choose, and then asset reference. And here we just drag in our dither material instance. And boom, right away, looks pretty awesome. We get that awesome dithering all around. You can see the different bands here. So what we should do now is go ahead and get our character and just set him sort of in the light over here next to the cylinder, because I like the way that those bands look. We can fine tune it better. And we'll also see the sky. Now that we have this, I'll go ahead and open up my material instance. I'll drag this to the side, close out of the master. And then I'll just go full screen. So the first thing that you can mess with is the bands. So here's 12 that we had on default. Here's 6, here's 2, or 3, and then 2. So you can see what it does. It really breaks up the color. It only allows a certain number of colors to be present. And the higher you make this, the softer everything will look. For example, if I make it 64, you can hardly even tell now. 32, you're starting to see it. 24, 16, 12. I think 12 is a decent middle ground there. The dither alpha is just simply how much of this effect. So if you dial it in, but it's still too much, you can tone this down a little bit. So like 0.75 or whoops, that's the wrong one. There we go. 0.5, 1. I'll leave it at 1. The dither bias is going to push the dither more towards the start of the band. So if I set this to be 1, you'll notice that now it's not dithered at all. 0.5 is just, slightly toned down. 0 is the default. Even 0.1 might be good to sort of tone down the effect. I'm going to leave it at 0 though. Dither contrast is similar, but basically, so look, if I set it to 0, it looks like this. If I set it to 1, that's the default, 1.5, 2. So this just makes the bands a little bit harsher. So there's 100. So there's a lot of stuff that you can play with here to get your own little style going. And then the dither size is the scale of this texture on the screen. And remember, depending on what you set your screen percentage to in your project settings earlier, you might have to adjust this a bit. Or depending on your monitor's resolution, I'm on 2560 by 1440, so this value works good for me. But here's 12, here's 5. So it looks like the lower that you make it, the smaller the texture is going to be. Here's 24, so now it's much more obvious. 50. So again, it just really depends on how you want it to look. So I like a value of 16. The next thing that we can test really quickly is how this looks in the shadow. I'm just going to make a little wall here. And I'm going to add a light. So if you hold L and click, it adds a light. And then I will change the, well, first, before I change the color, let's drag him over here just to see. So as you can see, he is affected by the light, and also the scene color is affected by the light too, which looks really awesome. It's banded and all of that, so that's looking great. And then even if we change the color, it automatically updates and works perfectly. Which I think looks really, really cool in red. But of course, you can mess around and set your light color to be whatever you want. But yeah, just so you know, it does work with colored lights, multiple lights, and it works obviously with the PBR values as well. So if you have a normal map on your character, if you have roughness, if you have metallic, it should all update. One thing to note is if you are wanting to make your character look shiny and the roughness isn't working, you might need to increase the metallic slightly. So we can look at that really quickly. If I just go into my master material for all of our PS1 characters, remember we added our vertex snapping material function and then just these two textures. Let's go ahead and create parameters for metallic and roughness. Save that. Go back. Actually, it looks like it's working fine at 0 metallic and 0 roughness. So he's extremely shiny right now. We turn on our values, go full screen. You can see as I move around, it's sort of shimmering. If I set roughness to 0.1 or 0.2, it'll be even more obvious that it's shiny. And the metallic, of course, will darken and make it look metallic. So you can really get creative with these different material parameters and create your own art style. For example, if you wanted everything just to look super flat, just set your roughness to 1, metallic to 0. And this is pretty close to how it, potentially looked back then. But if you want to get creative, maybe you're creating your own realistic hybrid of an art style, you could actually use textures for your metallic and roughness and do the entire PBR workflow if that's something that you're going for. Another thing just to keep in mind is, for example, earlier I had my shadows turned off, but since I had restarted the project, it actually sort of reset that, and it wouldn't be saved in a game anyway, like in your final packaged game. So if I just go back to viewport scalability, I set everything to medium and then shadows to low. Now you can see we have no shadows, and if I play, I'm sure I'll get extremely high FPS, but this doesn't really stick when you go to play. In this video, it really isn't about setting those settings permanently. And we have a video on the channel for Mizzo. He does an entire video of how to set up simple options and quality menus. So definitely go check out that. There'll be a card for that in the top right of the video. And he shows us how to set those values to be the values that are in your game and with the menu and all that. So definitely check that out. But you'll want to definitely check your values there. And for example, I set everything to be medium here and shadows to be low. Depending on what you're going for, you could keep everything on epic. It really just depends on what you want. A couple of other things to consider. One is you can actually limit your frame rate. I don't know really why you would want to do that in a modern day, because I think personally it feels really cool and really smooth to experience a game at really high frame rate, especially when you lower all the settings. But if you want that true old school feel, you could go to your project settings and then search for frame rate. And then find used fixed frame rate in engine general settings. Check that. And I already had mine set at 30 from previous testing, but if you set that there and then go to play, it will be in 30 FPS. So again, if you're going for that really nostalgic feel, you could limit your FPS to whatever value that you want. Another thing to consider is going into your character and changing the aspect ratio of the camera. So I'll go find my third person character in third person blueprints, BP third person character. And then we want to just click on the follow camera here. And then under camera options, select constrain aspect ratio. And it'll open up the settings here in aspect ratio. You can set it manually. I believe 1.333 is kind of what we're going for. But you can also select this drop down here, and there's a ton of preset options here. So the one that you probably want for really vintage, old school PS1 graphics is this first one here, but you can of course experiment with other ones that are 4:3. Really anything that says 4:3 will work. I'll just click this first one here, and then we'll compile, save, play. And as you can see, we're stuck in this vintage TV aspect ratio, which is pretty cool, and we're at 30 FPS, and I'm starting to feel like I'm playing a PS1, so pretty awesome. Lastly, I just want to touch on a few lighting settings to keep in mind when you're doing the lighting in your scene. And I just have the default lighting stuff here in my level, which I'll leave here. I think that that's fine. But if you go to the skylight, you'll notice that the mobility is set to movable by default. If you set it to stationary, you'll notice that it removes that black sort of blockiness in all the crevices. That's the distance field ambient occlusion that is enabled by default, which really looks nice on realistic games. But when you're doing any sort of post-processing, it can start to look very like it's artifacts. So I like setting it to stationary. Static removes it altogether, but then you're left with no skylights. So I like to leave it on stationary, and then I'll set real-time capture to be off. You'll want to keep this on if you're doing any sort of realistic art style, by the way. If you want real-time reflections and skylight update and all that, you'll leave that on. But we can turn that off and then switch source type to cube map. And then here in the cube map, you can set it to one of these. I'll just set it to the daylight ambient one. And then the reflections should use this. Again, you want to leave that on stationary static. Unfortunately, it makes it look really dark. And then the next thing that you can do is go into your post-process volume and search for VIG for vignette, and it'll check this to be on. And then if I set it from 0.4 to 0, you'll notice that the edge of the screen is no longer sort of dark. What vignette does is it adds sort of a cinematic darkness around the edges. So I like to remove that. And then lastly, I like to go into the bloom and go to intensity and just set it to be 1.5. Just makes it so that way things that glow or things that are bright, they get this sort of glowy effect near them. You don't want to make it too high or things will look blown out. But if I go full screen now and play, it looks a little bit more atmospheric. But if the bloom is too bright for you or you don't like how it looks, you can just go ahead and turn that down. All right, that's going to do it for this video. And just as a reminder, if you did have any trouble following along, or you just wanted to use this project as a starting point or reverse engineer it, you can go ahead and download this project on my Patreon, which again is currently half off until November. So definitely go ahead and take advantage of that legacy price, which you'll be locked in at for the future. This has been Vylocity with Pitchfork Academy, and I'll see you in the next one.